Well, now this is that guy again. This is Good Joseph, and I'm here to share with you why does it seem so hard to move from 1K all the way to 100K? Or should I say this way? It is hard to move from 1K to 100K than it is to move from 100K to 1 million. For those who have ever experienced this time, by the way, let me just ask you a very simple question. How long did it take you to actually accumulate 100,000 Kenyan shillings? How long did it take you? And by the way, just forget about the shilling name or whatever. Just use whatever the currency that you're using out there. So how long did it take you? Why is it hard? So that when you're actually starting off, it's way harder. But at least when you're moving to a substantive amount of money, the journey becomes a little bit easier and you enjoy the process. And that is exactly the video that I'm going to share with you for the next 14 minutes. Just hang around and make sure that you smash that like button. Make sure that you subscribe. Why? Because you'll be notified whenever I upload a new good video. And on the comment section, just tell me what you think, because I know just like an iron sharpens another iron, so do we learn from each other. Let's get in the business now. Here we are. See, when we say why is it hard to actually move from 1K to 100K, it is because if there is the hardest phase of your life is moving from 1K, let me just write it here, from 1K, all right, all the way to 100K. This is the hardest phase. This is the hardest. This is the hardest phase. Why? It is because basically here you're operating on scarcity. You're operating on the basis of you don't have it. And probably for you to make this amount of money, either you're employed. And this is why I always tell people, and I have to remind you this, because the day this thing will click inside of you, or the day these things that will click in your head, that's the time that things will become easier. You'll actually enjoy the process rather than complaining about the process. See, when you move from 100 or rather 1,000 shilling all the way to 100K, and this is dream of most of the people. Here, most of the people trade three things. You trade your energy, your skills, and time. And when you trade those three things, you are simply making that money in an active way. It takes a lot of time. Why? Because probably you're starting your life, or probably you aren't, you are just, by the way, if you're struggling from 1K to 100K, there's something called the hierarchy of priorities. At the foundational level, this is when we talk about the basic things. This is when we talk about the food, the shelter, the clothing. All right. And then we move to the next level. This is when now you start talking about the self-development and what have you and growth. That is what, by the way, you cannot speak the language of savings and investments if you're barely eating. Do you get what I'm saying? It's like going to a country that is experiencing wars and coups and what have you, and you're teaching them how to save and what have you. No, they need peace more than anything and everything. That's what happens now. See, when you're struggling with basics, this is when 1,000 shillings makes a lot of sense to you. Did you just get that sense? Now, what happens when you're the basic level and when you move to the next level? This is when you talk about personal growth. Personal growth here doesn't mean necessarily finances, although finance is part of it. Personal growth is where now you start asking yourself, okay, fine. Now that I've eaten, now that I've paid my rent and I'm clothing and my kids are in school, now how do I look my future? How is my future going to be? One day I ain't going to be working. I need to be somewhere. This is when you either work on your skills. This is when you work on your thing. And in that process, this money is required. And the only way you can achieve this money or this target or these savings is through by you getting that savings and investing it. So all this money is actually channeled towards these things. So it becomes a bit harder for you to move from 100,000 or from 1,000 shilling all the way to 100. Why? Because at this particular point, you're investing on your skills. Maybe you don't have a skill. Some people even think about going back to school. Some people think about, guess what? I have to work on how I present myself. I have to work about all those kind of things. That requires a lot of money when you're starting at the preliminaries. And the other reason why it appears as if it's so hard to achieve it is also, again, things to do with the psychological things or psychological reasons. Psychological reasons. This is a situation whereby you find, like, guess what? You're actually saving, let's say, 1,000 shilling per month. Continuously, you need yourself 100 months to do exactly that. If you divide this by 12, you realize that you need a lot of months for you to accumulate this amount of money. So there is this thing of the target that you want and where you are right now. For example, if I tell you, hey, let's embark on a savings challenge. For example, at the beginning of this year, I still have a group that we embarked on a challenge of saving 100,000. Some people have actually achieved the target, others are on the way, and that kind of things. Okay. Now, what happens is that the moment you compare where you want to go and where you are, for example, if you have 2,000 or 3,000 and you're aiming to get 100, and you can actually reflect on how much you usually make per month or per day or week or whichever the period of time, and you run that against that what you want, it appears as if it's a milestone. Truly it is a milestone, and also once you register that in your head, it even appears more harder. So moving from 1,000 to all the way to 100,000, this is where it requires three things. Although you must still require them even when you clock your million and what have you, but the hardest thing that you need to get or do or have is actually having three things that we call them, what we call the consistency, there's something called the discipline. Okay, you need to have the discipline, and the last thing you need to have is what we call the sacrifice. Okay, those are the three things that you need to have for you to actually reach particular target. So that's why it appears that it's very, very hard. If someone tells you, let's be saving 1,000 shillings in every month, let's be saving 1,000 or 3,000 or whichever the amount of money it is for us to accumulate that amount of money. Even if, let's say, we are saving 10,000 a month, we need 10 months to accumulate this amount of money. Tell me who is that discipline in the current world, the current century that we are in, to continuously save their 10,000 month 1, month 2, monthly, all the way to the month 10th for them to realize their 100,000. Tell me who has that discipline. Bearing in mind that nowadays a lot of people have what we call the instant gratification. You just want to get the thing, enjoy yourself, have fun, blah blah blah, and that kind of a thing. So you find most of the people, they save the month 1, the month 2, by the time they're in monthly 3, they have actually used the money that they saved on the month 1 or invested on the month 1, and then you go back to the same thing, you save again, you go back to the same thing, you go again, because you have two things that are affecting you, the internal and the external ones. And here you are controlled more by the internal ones. You know, you do not have that discipline of accumulating that money, saving it, and doing all those kind of things. That's why it becomes very tough for you to move from 100,000 all the way, or from 1,000 all the way to 100,000. And let me tell you one thing. There is a magic the moment you clock this amount of money. The journey becomes a little bit smooth and easier if then you clock your first 100,000. I made a video about this last time. You can go check it out. Why does the net worth skyrocket the moment you clock the 100,000? And this is the reason. The moment you now clock the 100,000, reaching your million shilling. By the way, I always tell people, this is what I always tell people. If you've ever managed to get yourself 100,000, you can manage a million. And if you've ever gotten yourself an 1,000,000 shilling, you can actually manage to get 10 of these. And the moment you get these 10 of these, you can actually go ahead and get the 100 of these. In simple terms, I'm saying this. The moment you have this amount of money, which is 100,000, to 10x it, it's easier. The only thing that you need to do, you don't need to overly discover new things. You only need to stay on the lane. Use the discipline that you had. Use the consistency that you had and the things that you are doing. But now do them in a larger magnitude. Why? Say, when you have 100,000, or rather when you have 1,000 shilling, and this one I'm going to teach you here. When you have 1,000 shilling and the target is 100,000, then you can ask yourself, how am I going to use this 1,000 to help me reach the 100,000? How are you going to do that? Use this 1,000 as a tool. If then you were to go and purchase something and resell it, probably logically, this 100,000 or this 1,000 shilling, assuming that is giving you a return of say 10%, that's the 10%, that is 100 shilling out of it. Then you need like sort of a 10 months or whatever the period it is for you to accumulate another 1,000 of it, or to simply to 2x this amount of money. It becomes a little bit complicated, but not impossible. It is very much possible. See, when you have, let me tell you one secret, you need money to make money. Let no one ever lie that to you. You need money to make money, that's for sure. But when you don't have the money, what do? You trade the three things that I told you: the time, the skills, and the energy. Now, when you do not have a substantive amount of money, obviously the returns, for example, if you throw this amount of money to a money market fund, does not give you that substantive return, does not give you that money that you can say, hey, you know what, can you imagine this? You throw this 1,000 shilling into a money market fund, you get 100 shilling at the end of the year. Sounds too small, isn't it? Indeed it is, okay? But the moment you start leveraging a substantive amount of money, but then if you throw this 100,000 into a money market fund, you get yourself 10,000. Wow, that makes sense. So what if you were to stay into that game for a little bit or longer period of time, realizing 1,000,000 shilling, it becomes a bit, okay, it becomes a possibility and such kind of a thing. And this is where I was there, before I digress a lot. I was saying if you've ever reached yourself 100,000, reaching 1,000,000, It is simply a matter of time. The question of if is no longer there. It's a matter of time. Now, the moment you clock 100,000, this is when you can leverage on two things. You can leverage on what you are doing to get the 100,000. That's another source of income. And also you can leverage on the virtue of you having this 100,000. You can use it as a tool to facilitate you reach this one. And that's why you find most people do start a business when the moment you clock this amount of money. You're like, guess what? If I get this 100,000, I can be able to get into the poultry farming. I can actually go ahead and get into what we call, buying a specific thing. There was someone who actually got this amount of money and he said, you know what, Joseph, I'm getting into the avocado business. And this is what he was doing. He got the 100,000. He showed up to the customers or the farmers who are growing the avocados, and he got some substantive amount of it. Then he was selling it to the people who have big companies that export the avocados. Now, you find this guy, what he was doing, he wasn't even making like a huge profit because obviously he wasn't exporting by himself. He was selling to the companies that are exporting, and then the guy was making something. But again, avocados are seasonal. Here in Kenya, you find there's a time there is and there's a time that is not. And then when there is not, the guy would shift to other products. He was actually selling onions. He could go to a place, grab the onions. We have a place here in Kenya called Kiawara. He was grabbing those onions and selling to, to those markets and what have you. Like you actively engage yourself. And in one round, the guy would actually go and get the thing for 100,000, and he would go and get maybe, let's say, 10,000 or 15,000 or 12,000 or thereabout in one round, or even 6,000. Let's just only call it 6,000 in a period of, let's say, 4 days or 5 days. You see, now you start leveraging on time, or rather start leveraging on the amount. You start leveraging on the amount, and by the time you realize you made your first 6,000, you've made your second 6,000, you've made your third 6,000, and then by the time you realize that the money is actually growing and multiplying at a higher rate. And I always tell people this: the moment you are in 1,000 all the way to 100,000, I largely educate people and actually encourage people, please focus on what we call business models. Focus on the business models. What you suffer from when you're in this bracket, it's not really about investment. You're not suffering from the investment. You're suffering from businesses. And never forget this. Okay, fine. Let me not use the term business. Let me allow you to use the term. You're suffering from cash flow. What you don't have is the cash flow. Focus on how you can generate money, especially if you're young. I always tell people, please don't play safe too early, because if you say play safe too early, then ain't gonna multiply that amount of money. Go ahead and engage in businesses that can actually multiply your money. And of course, I know you understand, the moment you engage in businesses, they have high risk because they have high return. So when you leverage on these things, you can be able to do something as far as your investments are concerned. Now, in a nutshell, to just recap what I've exactly said, why is it hard to move from 1,000 shilling all the way to 100,000? Because you do not have amount of money that you can leverage on to make more out of it. Even if you were to use that money that you have as a tool, it becomes too little, and actually the returns that you get from that too little is obviously too little. That name exists anyway. So that's why it is hard. And again, when you're actually struggling from 1,000 to 100,000, you're talking the language of the basics. Most of the people who are talking about, hey, I want to reach the 100,000, if you realize they are not yet stable when it comes to the basic things and what have you. They are still struggling what we call from hand to mouth, even sacrificing or having that a little bit of money that they can put aside for the purposes of savings becomes a bit harder. And if they were to save 1,000 in a month, it is a so big deal. It's like you who are in the language of millions saving like 800,000. It is so steep that you can even feel the effect. Okay, now when you actually hit the 100,000, why it is a bit easier compared to the first phase? It is because now the 100,000, well, in Kenyan market, it is quite of a presentable amount of money, and there are a variety of engagement that you can be able to do. You can use that money, solve multiple problems, get returns out of it, and once you do that, then you can be able to make some cash out of that exactly thing. And now that's why you find it's easier to move from 100,000 to 1,000,000. Perhaps to add a little bit of flesh on meat or whatever they think it is, go check that video of mine called why skyrocketing, or why the net worth usually skyrocket the moment you clock your 100,000. That's good, Joseph. If you'd like to have a conversation with me, my number is always on the description of this specific video. Grab that number, give me a call. We can talk a business, finance, goodbye, and see you in the next one.